Well, hello everyone. This is the first of 3 videos on how to load data into D3. I've broken this into 3 little videos so that you can find the materials that you're most interested in. The first video here is just going to be about the basics about loading into D3, how it works, how we call the functions, what the data looks like when it gets in. But the second video is about an error that with 100% certainty you are going to encounter. It is called the cross-origin resource sharing error, and it's because the web has a policy called the same origin policy. And as soon as we start to load data into D3, we're going to break that policy, and so we're going to encounter this error. So the second video is just about how to work around that error. And the third video is going to be about how to work with the asynchronicity of these D3 functions. In a language like Python, every function executes sequentially. So as soon as one function ends, the next one could start, and when that one finishes, the next one can start, but that's not really the case in JavaScript. And it's not really the case when we're loading data. So the third video is about how to work with the data once we get it in and how to handle that asynchronicity. This is some code that we have up on class in one of the code alongs, and all this does is takes a data set. Here it's called my data. This is a list or an array of a couple of numbers, and what we do is create a couple of circles based on those numbers. And so you can see here the D3 code. So we're binding that list or that array called my data, and we're creating a series of circles on it. And you can see we're using the enter data set. We're appending a circle for every unbound data element. And then we're starting to apply some attributes, right? Center X, center Y, radius, fill. But in the long run, this is not really how we're going to use our data, because we don't always want to hard code that into our JavaScript. We might want to point to a variety of different external data files and load those data files and display them in our data viz. So it's one of the important things about D3, about that interactivity. So the less that we hard code, the better we'll be, because we'll be more flexible in the end. So we need to load external data into D3. Now, if we're doing that in Python or any other language, we can easily open and read and write external data files. When we call open in Python, for example, we create a kind of metaphoric pipeline. And so it's a two-way pipeline. We can push data from our Python script out into the external data file. That is to say, we can write data, and we can actually read data coming the other way. So we can take data from the external file and bring it into our Python script and start to work with it. When we close the file at the end, then that metaphoric pipeline there either closes or disappears entirely. And so the two are independent one more time. That's exactly what we want to do in JavaScript right now, except JavaScript doesn't let us do it. JavaScript doesn't have any external capacity to read and write external data files. And that's by design, because we don't want to go visit a website and have the website suddenly start deleting files on our hard drive, or reading data from our hard drive, or putting new files on our hard drive either. So JavaScript just doesn't ever have the open read, write, close that most scripting languages do. So the website is kind of quarantined or isolated or black boxed in that way, and it's really disconnected independently from our hard drive. So that's getting in our way right now, because this is exactly what we want D3 to do. But D3 has a series of functions that we can use. Here's a couple of them right here. And so depending on what the data structure is that we're trying to bring in, D3 has a function. In fact, there are a couple more not listed here that we can use in order to read data. The one that we're going to use in this next series of videos is the d3.csv. And we've talked about CSV files before, comma separated values. These are the kind of lingua franca of all spreadsheets. Spreadsheets can export data to CSV. Every spreadsheet on the planet can read a CSV file. And we can even create them even if we don't have a spreadsheet. So a little later in this video, I'm going to create one just in my plain text editor. A lot of spreadsheets work with tab-separated value files as well. Not a problem for D3. There's a D3.tsv function that reads tab-separated values. It's not surprising, I suppose, that D3 can also read JSON. JSON is the really, really prominent built-in inherent native data structure for JavaScript object notation. Almost every API on the planet will deliver data in JSON format, so it should not be surprising that D3 can read JSON data. I don't think right. Interestingly, also we can work with XML data. We can bring XML data into D3. We still need to parse the XML file, and so we've talked a little bit before about the document object model, the DOM tree, and what happens is that XML will be brought in, and then we'll have to start to parse it as if it's a DOM tree with XPath or something else, right? Now, under the hood, D3 uses some things called AJAX requests, which is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. We're not going to go very far into that, but I am going to talk about that a little bit in the second video, because the more we know about that, the more the error is going to make sense for us. All right, well, let's look at some code here. I've got 3 documents open in my text editor. The first one here is just an HTML file. And you'll notice that there's nothing unusual here that we haven't seen before, very, very, very little. You'll notice that in the head section, I have a script tag that's loading the D3 library, and I'm loading it straight from the external URL, and there's a .min in there, right? So remember that what that means is that I'm using the minified version, and that minified version is a smaller file. It's just not really human readable, but it's the one that we use a lot because it's easier, faster to download. Again, if you want to read the whole thing, just go to that URL and take out the .min, and you'll be fine, and you can see the original JavaScript as it's written. The body section has nothing in it. It just has a header level 2, and in fact, in videos 1 and 2 here, I'm not even going to touch the body, but I'll do some work with that in the third video. And then down at the bottom here in my code on line 14, you'll notice that I do have another script tag, and I'm loading my own personal datavislibrary.js here. And I'm doing that again at the bottom because when I start to use D3 to manipulate this DOM tree, I need the browser to have drawn the DOM tree, to have constructed it. And if I put my script up in the head section, the DOM tree will not be constructed yet. So we typically dump those down at the bottom. Now, there's some other tricks I can use to make sure that the D3 code does not execute till the DOM tree is finished, but this is an easy trick for now, just to stick it down to the bottom. We talked a little bit earlier about how I'm going to import a CSV file, and here's the CSV file that I've created, phenomenally complicated. And what you'll notice is that the first row here is a header row, and so I would have in a spreadsheet 2 columns. I would have one column called fruit, and I would have one column called count. And so you'll notice I just have oranges, apples, bananas, and pears. Those are going to go into the column 1, and then the count of those, why I have a count, I have no idea. It's going to be 3, 2, 5, and 1, and that's going to be in the second column. But again, a CSV file has no formatting. It doesn't have any fonts. It doesn't have any italics. It doesn't have any colors. It doesn't have anything. This is just a bare bones plain text file, and that's all it is. Now, if I look at where this is, you'll notice that I have put it inside a folder called data. And so when we load our file here in just a second, you'll see that I need to look inside a folder called data for a file called fruit.csv. Here's my DataVis library as it stands. Over the next couple of videos, we're going to be expanding this little DataVis library. But you'll see here the bare bones now of the D3 CSV load. Remember, there were 2 parameters. The first one is the file that I'm going to load, and so that says I look in the folder called data, and inside that folder I look for a document called fruit.csv. And the second parameter is a callback function, and that callback function will get executed for every row in that data file. And so what happens is that D3 loads in one row from fruit.csv, and whatever that data is, it passes it to this callback function. Now that callback function may be a named function, but here I'm just using an anonymous function. And so it has no name whatsoever and is only that part of my code. So this bottom part, line 10 here, there's a little bit of punctuation down there, but I think you can see what's happening. That curly brace at the left is the closing curly brace for my anonymous function, followed by a right-hand parenthesis, which matches the left-hand parenthesis of d3.csv open. And then, of course, there's a semicolon at the end because lines 8, 9, 10 here all create one JavaScript statement. And just like in English, every sentence ends with a semicolon. So that's my 3 parts of my code. So now let's load that up. All right, so here's a browser. I just happen to have Chrome open, but obviously you can use anything that you want. What I'm going to do is go into the View menu, and I'm going to open the JavaScript console down here at the bottom. You can see there are a couple of errors from Google, but that's totally fine. Don't worry about any of that stuff. We'll just ignore that for now. And what I'm going to do is go to surf to that particular page. I have that, as you can see in the URL here, up on the HukoDev server. I happen to put it in, obviously my account in a folder called dataviz, and then dataviz.html. And so if I surf to that page, you can see exactly what happens. That the H2 header loads up here at the top, loading data with d3.csv. And what we can see down here at the bottom is the console log of all of the data that I just happened to load. If you remember looking at the code, the console log was the only executable statement that I had in that callback function. So what happens is that for every row in that CSV file, it hands that row to the callback function, which logs it to the console window. So I can see what my data is down here. It actually comes in a really, really nice format. You'll notice that it's a little kind of JSON object. It's a key value pair. So the key is fruit, and the value is oranges. The key is count. The value is 3. That's fantastic. So every single one of those rows now gets logged to the console. And so you can see that it even has a little informative note down here, fetch finished loading, right? That's fantastic. So there were 4 rows in my CSV file, and I get 4 little data elements here. In passing, note that all of those counts are strings, right? They are not numbers, but they are strings. So we'll work with that a little bit in the 3rd video. You'll notice that there's a DevTools error up here. There's a browser polyfill that didn't load. Just ignore that. It doesn't really matter one bit. Let's review really briefly this idea about variable scope. This is something that we've talked a lot about when we were working on functions, but now that we're using these callback functions as a way to handle and manipulate data in D3, it's going to be really important for us to remember what's happening. So let's imagine that I have library.js. And inside of library.js, I create a new variable called dataset. I'm using my var keyword here because I'm a good JavaScript programmer. And what dataset is a variable that lives in global scope. So dataset is accessible or visible everywhere throughout that blue chart. And in fact, even if I load multiple libraries in my browser, dataset as a variable is accessible and viewable everywhere, right? Remember, scope is like vision, right? Where can this thing be seen? Like telescope, microscope. And if it is in scope, what that means is that I am allowed to assign new values to dataset, and I'm allowed to use the value of dataset in other places. Now, if I add some functions to my library, here I have an anonymous function in green and one in yellow, these variables are called locally scoped. So basket is scoped locally to the green function, and so I can only see it and use it when I am inside the green function. Money is locally scoped to the yellow function. So I can only assign to it or read from it when I happen to be executing the yellow function. Now, what I would like to do, though, is to take that data set that we have just loaded from our CSV file, and I want to make sure that it is in the global scope so that other functions can use it. I want to make sure that D3 can use it. I want to make sure that any of my other functions can use it. And so I need to guarantee in that callback function that my data set is actually properly globally scoped. So what happens here in this vision is in the green function, I can actually assign values to the variable called dataset. Here I'm assigning an array, 1, 2, 3, but it could be anything else that I wanted to assign. And so the dataset variable, because it is scoped globally, is accessible in any other function. It would be accessible in the yellow function as well. And so I can read from dataset, I can write to dataset, and now I need to make sure that the data that I bring in from that CSV file is accessible and available to every other function in D3. And so we're going to modify our callback function to do this. We're going to take that locally scoped variable and we're just going to copy it into a globally scoped variable. And we'll do that in our library here in just a second. So it's going to look something like this, right? So if I call my d3.csv file in exactly the way that we have, the d3.csv load passes each row to my anonymous function. Data here is a variable that works like a bit of a catcher's mitt. It catches or collects the data that has been passed to it by D3. But data is a locally scoped variable. So by the time my anonymous function ends, data will cease to exist. And that's no good if I want to keep this data around for a little bit, right? So what I need to do is I need to create a new variable in the global space. We could call it dataset, just like I did before. And once I create that in the global space with the var keyword, now it's going to be accessible to other functions elsewhere. And in fact, what I want to do is something like this. I want to take the data that has been passed to the anonymous function in a local variable, and I just want to copy it into a global variable. And so you'll see this pattern a lot, not just in D3, but in a lot of other kinds of programming as well. The reason that I'm copying variables there, it might look like I'm just doing a bunch of nonsense, but one of those data is locally scoped, the other data set is globally scoped. And so I want to make sure that I keep that straight. Now, here's a little cautionary note. This is how we're going to write this in just a second. I mentioned that every row in the CSV file, I didn't put data here, but it's data/fruit.csv. Every row in that data set is passed one by one by one by one into the anonymous function. So what happens is data isn't an entire list or an entire array of little JSON objects. It's just one JSON object at a time. So to be smarter about this, what I need to do is to push that data onto data set. So every row that comes in, I want to create a data set, a bigger list, a bigger array. So I get row 1, I push that row onto data set. I get row 2, I push that row onto data set. Row 3, etc., etc., etc. And you'll notice here I'm still logging the original locally scoped data variable, but that's okay. So let's change our library and then we'll run this up on the server. All right, so here's our revised library. And so you'll notice here in my code in line 7, I've actually created the dataset variable. I've made that be an empty array, and I just put in a little comment there that this is in global scope. Remember, in JavaScript, the double slash is a comment that goes until the end of the line. So that just says to the browser, ignore this double slash to the end of line 7 and then start over on line 8. And so you'll notice also in my anonymous function on line 10, I have a new line that is pushing the data row onto the global variable data set. And I added a little comment there that says, I'm just moving the local data to the global variable. And so I'm accumulating row by row by row a giant array of little JSON objects, which is great. I'm still logging, on line 11, I'm still logging the particular data row to the console, so I'll be able to see that at the bottom. But again, we notice, and we saw this before, that that data row gets logged one by one by one by one by one, and it doesn't really aggregate. It doesn't put together into one giant data set. So let's load that up in the browser. All right, so here's our browser window open, same one we had before. We have changed the library a little bit, but we haven't changed the output necessarily. So if I reload this page, everything should look the way that it did before. I haven't changed body, so that should be the same. I haven't changed anything that's logging to the console, so that hasn't changed either. So if I reload this page, there it is. That's all great. All right. The only thing that's different now is that I have a variable called dataset. And so if I look to see what dataset is, you'll notice that now I have a list. I have an array. So down here at the bottom, I have square brackets, which signifies a list. These are ordered, as we know, indexed 0, 1, 2, and 3. And you'll notice that every one of those data elements in the list is a little JSON object. It has two key value pairs, fruit and count. And again, just in passing, notice that those counts are all strings, and we'll change that. You'll notice that this is a little out of order here, which is okay. This is going to be something that we're going to talk about in the third video, which is the asynchronous nature of all of this work. So this is the end of this first video about loading data sets. In video 2, what I'm going to do is take exactly this code and I'm going to put it on my laptop instead of on the server. And, spoiler alert, it's not going to work. We're going to have an error. So the next video is all about that error and how we work around it and how we fix it. All right, thanks.